Okay. Let's talk about it here. Let's talk about what people have been bringing up in the Montreal media as of late. Specifically, a brief little mention of this was in Elliotte Friedman's 31 Thoughts. I'll leave a link in the description to that. As well as Le Journal de Montréal. There was an article posted the other day specifically about this. Let's talk about whether or not the Montreal Canadiens are sellers. Sellers at the trade deadline. Is this the fate that the Montreal Canadiens are going to have to go down as the season goes towards its end? Because if you take a look at the Montreal season as of late, it hasn't necessarily been the best. Taking a look at how the Montreal Canadiens have been performing all year, things are not really in a spot where they can comfortably say they're going to probably be in the playoffs. Let's read Elliotte Friedman's 12th thought on 31 Thoughts from the most recent edition here. After adding Ilya Kovalchuk, Habs GM Marc Bergevin met with his team, telling them, "I still believe in you." Since then, they lost to Pittsburgh in overtime, to Winnipeg and Detroit in regulation. All of a sudden, the Habs are 7 points out, with 4 clubs between them and the second Philadelphia Flyers wildcard spot. By moving Mike Riley for Scandella, Bergevin opened up a spot on next year's blue line for Alexander Romanov, because Riley has another year on the contract, Scandella doesn't. Internally, the Canadiens also considered Sven Baertschi as an option from Vancouver, but that needed to involve Dale Weiss, and it couldn't work. So, Bergevin won't move his prospects, but if they don't climb back into it, what about his veterans? If you're taking a look at that right there, moving the prospects and him not moving the prospects, this is kind of a contradiction to the idea that I was building up in my head on whether or not the Canadiens would actually be buyers. Because if you take a look at the NHL standings right now, let's do that. NHL standings. Okay. Eastern Conference, and okay. The Canadiens are currently 6th in the Atlantic with 43 points. The Sabres have 45, the Panthers have 49, the Leafs 54 for the Lightning, and 61 for the Bruins. The Montreal Canadiens have really just hit that wall. And we talked about this in the Detroit video yesterday. Was that yesterday? 2 days ago, I think. No, actually it was yesterday. Detroit versus Montreal, where Zadina got the dagger. This was a big point that I brought up. The Montreal Canadiens and their wall that they have seemed to have hit. It was highlighted by Kevin Bieksa on Tim and Sid that the Habs every year just seem to hit a wall where they lose all these games in a row. They've hit that wall now and are now out of the playoffs by quite a sustainable margin because of it. So the idea of the Montreal Canadiens becoming sellers is something to bring up for sure. Now, the article on Le Journal de Montréal brings up a whole bunch of names. Not just the veterans like Elliotte Friedman brings up on his Sportsnet 31 Thoughts article, but guys like Domi, guys like Tatar, guys like Weber, and Carey Price. Well, just taking a look at it right now, if you take a look at the Montreal Canadiens and their roster, you're not trading Weber. There's no way anyone's taking that contract. You're not trading Price. There is no way anyone is taking that contract. But what you do have is flexibility with virtually every other player on this roster. Now, some of them are in an RFA or a UFA scenario, and that opens them up to a little bit more negotiability. Is that a word? Negotiability? I'm not too sure, but you know what I mean, right? Guys like Domi are on a $3.15 million cap hit till the end of this season. Guys like Weiss, a $2.35 million cap hit until the end of this season. Thompson and Cousins are in that spot too. Marco Scandella was highlighted as a guy that the Canadiens would probably not have on their blue line next season because that spot will probably be filled by Alexander Romanov if he decides to come over. So let's talk about some of these other players that were mentioned in the trade selling kind of article that was published by Le Journal de Montreal. Tomas Tatar, are we trading him? No. Tomas Tatar is quite a valuable player to this Habs team already, and trading him will take a mediocre Montreal Canadiens team and make it an even worse Montreal Canadiens team. He is a very positive player, and net positive, and losing out on him, no matter the return, will be a net negative. And I say that because there's no realistic scenario where the Canadiens trade Tomas Tatar for a player that is better than Tomas Tatar. They could trade for several other assets that could potentially equal a Tomas Tatar, but that's not proper asset management now, isn't it? Would you rather have one big fish of 100% points or two big fish of 50% points? It doesn't really work out that way, especially when you're dealing with a player who is as valuable to a team like Tomas Tatar is. You could say the same about Max Domi, but in the age category. Domi is going up and up, but he's only 24 years old. Sure, his season this year hasn't been the best, but at the same time, you can't deny that there is talent going down the line that is available. So, when it comes to the rest of the Canadiens, who else is there? Hey, there's Ilya Kovalchuk. That guy, he expires at the end of the year, and he's been not terrible with the Canadiens. In fact, I would go as far to say that he's been kind of good. He's suiting up on the second line with Nick Suzuki here tonight, and that is a very interesting sign because he has honestly just been so productive in the short, limited amount of time that he's been here. Is he a player that the Montreal Canadiens think about trading in the future? Well, yeah, that's kind of something that people have been talking about ever since he was brought in. He was brought in a position where people were saying if the Habs are not in the playoffs by the deadline, and it's kind of clear that they're not going to make the playoffs, in no shape or fashion are the Canadiens going to be buyers, but instead they're going to probably be sellers because they have an Ilya Kovalchuk who has had some time to prove his worth and who could probably be, in some form or another, helpful to a playoff team. So Ilya Kovalchuk is a guy that I think definitely has that spotlight as being a potential trade piece for the Canadiens at the deadline if things go south, and things have kind of been going south over the past few weeks since the Canadiens haven't been winning too many games. There was another name, though, that people have been mentioning in this selling kind of talk, and that's Jeff Petry. Petry is somebody who is so valuable to this Montreal Canadiens team that if the Canadiens were to trade Petry, it would require a heck of a big package for them to say yes. This is kind of the same argument that people were bringing up with Chris Tanev and the Vancouver Canucks a few years ago, but Petry getting traded would almost certainly be a guaranteed loss for the Habs. And this is because Petry to the Habs is so much more valuable than Petry would be to any team that he would be traded to. If you're trading Jeff Petry at the deadline, who are you trading him to? You're not trading him to a bottom feeder team, no. You're not trading him to a team like the Canadiens that are really far out of the bubble for the playoffs. You're trading Petry to a playoff contender. If you're trading a player who is as good as Petry is, you're trading him to a playoff contender, a team that will most certainly make the playoffs, and that could definitely use some extra help from a Petry. However, if you take a look at it from that perspective, who is Petry more valuable to? The Canadiens team that is way out the playoffs, or a bubble team or a playoff team that is already in the playoffs and would just add Petry to their top six, maybe in their bottom or their middle pairing? The Canadiens have so much more valuable instilled into Jeff Petry that it wouldn't make sense for any other playoff team to give up what Canadiens fans would say is an equal trade for Jeff Petry. Because at the end of the day, Petry to the Habs is so much more valuable than Petry would be to any other playoff team. And that to me is probably the biggest hurdle as to why the Canadiens will not part with Jeff Petry. His value is so much more established and defined with the Canadiens than it would be with any other team, and there's no team that would be able to match the value that the Canadiens have in Petry. So to him, I'm saying no. he's not the guy that the Canadiens are going to trade. If anything, it's going to be Kovalchuk. It's going to be some of these other guys that are expiring. Maybe a Marco Scandella gets on the move, but I doubt it. There are some other players here, depth players like Thompson and Cousins and Dale Weiss, who are in the discussion to being traded because they do expire next season. But for the most part, the Canadiens are in a position where I wouldn't be surprised if they just rode out the rest of the season with the roster they have. If they're not going to make the playoffs, I don't see them needing to add anybody in the short term. And if they're this far out of the playoffs where they're not a bottom feeder, but they're not necessarily in the playoff bubble yet, I don't see them needing to sell all too high either. Kovalchuk is probably the only exception to that, but obviously there is a discussion to be had. So I hope you comment down in the comments below what you think about this whole scenario. Are the Habs going to be sellers? And if so, who do they give up? Is it just Kovalchuk, or is there more than meets the eye to that discussion? I hope you enjoyed this video. This was recorded in one take, so I'm really happy with that. Så är det där, and bye.